Welcome, everyone. Bem-vindos. My name is João Bill. I'm director of the Brazil Lab and also teaching anthropology and at the Woodrow Wilson School with the program in global health and health policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all today. We are here to hear and discuss about solidarity and activism when democracy fails. It couldn't be a timelier theme, and we are so happy that we have people from various backgrounds, various disciplines, various generations here, and I think that's what it takes to build solidarity and activism in these dark times. So we are extremely honored to have the wondrous Alessandra Orofino with us today, and Federico Neuburg, a Brazilian anthropologist who will be a discussant. So last summer, when we were doing the global seminar in Rio, we had the pleasure of meeting the Peers Global Seminar in Rio with Pedro and Miqueias, Pedro Meira Monteiro and Miqueias Mugi. We had the pleasure of meeting Alessandra and learning about the important work that she and her partner Miguel Lago developed, Meu Rio and Nossas, and she will talk about this. But what was so striking was the way the younger generation, the students, could relate to the ways they are thinking about the political via technology, via various kinds of concrete engagements in issues that matter most to people where they live, and the effort to reclaim citizenship. Right, in unusual ways, not necessarily always through the electoral politics or the ways we generally associate with or reduce democracy to. Really trying to break open new grounds for civic and political engagement in Brazil in ways that matter to people and their local communities. So Alessandra is the co-founder and executive director of the nonprofit Nossas. Ours in Portuguese, right, standing for our cities, where she develops tools and methodologies for activism and civic participation. She's a fellow of the Obama Foundation. She's also a Skoll fellow. Alessandra also does this very creative work. She's a director of Greg News, which is HBO's comedy news show. And it's quite something, so you can check. She can tell us a little bit about that as well in the Q&A, how it is to transition and how it is to create humor or to work with humor in these times. And she's a columnist for the newspaper Folha de São Paulo in Brazil. She holds degrees in economics and human rights from Columbia University and political science from the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. Alessandra was a faculty member of the New York School of Visual Arts and contributed to its pioneering program in design for social innovation. Federico Neuburg, he is spending the year as a member in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study this year, originally from Argentina, but through Mexico he became a most wonderful Brazilian, and he's a professor in the Museu Nacional, which was tragically destroyed by fire, a year and a half ago, and he specializes in economic anthropology, focusing on moral values and the socio-technical legal devices marshaled during economic emergencies. He has recently co-authored The Real Economy, The Cultural History of Money, and Conversas Etnográficas Haitianas. Besides doing fieldwork in Brazil and Argentina, he has also done extensive collaborative fieldwork in Haiti. So it's a treat for us to have Alessandra, so we'll hear from her for about 25-30 minutes, and then Federico will share some comments, ask one question or two, and then we will open up to a conversation with you all. Thank you for being here. Let's give Alessandra our warmest welcome to Princeton.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you, João, for the invitation, and all the Brazil Lab team for the warm welcome. Can you hear me well? Should I? Okay. So, well, it's a pleasure, really, to be here. It's also a challenge for me to represent this work in a way that honors the people that do it in Brazil, the activists that work with us. So I'm trying to figure out some strategies to really bring their voices into the room. I thought I would start just by giving you a brief overview of what I do, what I've been doing for the past few years, and then show you a few concrete examples of how that's played out, and then share with you some of the thinking that is behind the work and how that thinking has evolved in this particular time for our democracy and for our institutions back in Brazil. And I hope that for those of you who aren't Brazilian, that would also inspire you to think about other political contexts and how similar work could apply there. So to begin with, as Ron said, I'm the co-founder of an organization that was initially called Meu Rio. That means My Rio in Portuguese, and then grew to become a bigger organization that now works across the country in different cities in Brazil. And My Rio was founded at the end of 2011, turn of the 11-12. And at the time, Rio was undergoing this very particular interesting moment of its history, with a lot of money flowing into the city and big urban transformations being planned for the city because of the World Cup and the Olympic Games, and the fact that we found massive amounts of oil offshore, and that sort of changed the political game very quickly in Rio. So our public officials at the time presented the city and its citizens with big plans for urban transformation. And my co-founder and I at the time feared that those plans were not reflect the needs, the wants, the real aspirations of the citizenry. So we co-founded My Rio as a way of organizing citizens of Rio so they could have their voices be heard inside of decision-making spaces in the city. And that meant essentially following the work of the executive, following the work of the legislative, and organizing citizens so they could pressure these decision makers at different decision-making points and advocate for themselves on behalf of their communities, their neighborhoods, their needs. So that was back in 2011, 2012. And since then, Rio and Brazil have undergone a gigantic transformation. And we have seen that transformation happen very closely because of the work that we do. And we sort of followed a generation of people in a way that sort of entered politics since that time. It's been almost a decade now. We really followed that generation closely and saw how their political engagement evolved over time. In a way, the organization has aged as we aged. So when we started, most of our membership, it's a membership-based organization, most of our membership was sort of 18 to 24, and now it's skewing more towards 24 to 29. So things have changed a little bit. But we can see very clearly how the type of political engagement that young people in particular believe in and can get behind has changed. And that is a result, in our minds, of the information environment and how that has changed, but also, of course, of the political and democratic environment itself. As I was telling you, we started in Rio and then we grew. When we reached the first 100,000 members in Rio, we already had a few campaign victories under our belts, and other people in other cities in Brazil started reaching out to us and asking for guidance so they could actually set up organizations similar to ours in their cities. So we created something called the Rede Nossas Cidades, Our Cities Network, where we select and train leaders in different cities so they can do this work autonomously. So we're not controlling their work. We're essentially passing on the methodology, passing on the technologies that we have developed, and allowing them to do that themselves. But then on top of that city infrastructure, these different activist groups in different cities, we also started developing projects that leverage that presence and have citizen engagement and mobilization at their core, but are not necessarily about city life. I have a few examples of those. So in order to really bring sort of the voices of the people that we work with into this room, which is a very privileged room, and I'm sure they'll be very proud to have their voices be heard here, I wanted to show you two very quick videos on different aspects of the work. Actually 3, but let's see if we have time for all of them. So this one is just, I won't show all of it. It's about 4 minutes long. I'll just show the beginning of it. It's one of our first campaign victories in Rio when we, it was the most symbolic campaign that we did in the very early days of Meu Rio. And it was about a public school that was marked for demolition in the city of Rio. And it was standing right next to the Maracanã Stadium, the biggest stadium in the country. And in preparation for the World Cup, there was this push to demolish that school and turn it into a parking lot that would serve the stadium. So we worked with students and the school community there to keep the school standing. It's worth noting that was a particularly good public school. That was an example to other public schools in the area. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about that because I think it really exemplifies the type of work that we set up at that time. Can you hear this? Yeah? I'm not sure if it's coming from... Yeah. There are English subtitles, I apologize. Because it would be a little bit hard for some of you. There you go. That's easier.
De Desenvolvimento da Educação Básica, uma avaliação do governo federal, ela era a terceira colocada, melhor escola, e a gente não vê motivo para isso, para destruir a escola.
Foi divulgado na época que isso seria destruído, mas tem estacionamento. Não é só um espaço físico que funciona. Existe todo um contexto aqui que simplesmente o Estado queria dizimar.
Quando você fala estádio do Maracanã, vem no imaginário das pessoas. E você fala de Maracanã, você chega na escola federal.
Quando eu vi sendo retirado no direito básico dos meus filhos, eu falei, gente, tem alguma coisa acontecendo de errado. Em 2009 houve uma ameaça de demolição, foi publicado o edital sem nenhum tipo de consulta, sem nenhum tipo de participação popular.
Saiu no jornal a primeira notícia que a escola seria demolida e seria transferida para outro lugar. Os pais começaram a se mobilizar.
Eles se envolvendo no processo, vamos dizer, o que podemos fazer? E começamos a marcar as reuniões.
Quem vai falar é o pai da Bia, não sei se você sabe quem é o Carlos.
Evoluir, e vocês querem meu país, querem destruir, demolir.
A mamãe mandou um pedido para o site do Meu Rio, pedindo uma panela de pressão.
Teve um apoio de mais de 15 mil pessoas, assinaram, apoiando a manter a escola.
Daí pra frente, se tornou uma briga tipo, a minha escola.
Eles foram pra Câmara, eles bateram na porta do vereador e disseram assim, meu irmão, olha só, vocês têm que se comprometer com essa causa aqui.
October 2012, Mario's United Children, Professors and Parents.
A gente teve que se reinventar diversas vezes. Primeiro a pressão é na secretária de Educação naquele momento, é por Twitter, é por e-mail, e ao longo desse ano a gente foi fazendo uma série de ações.
A gente tinha receio de que durante as férias eles destruíssem a escola sem nenhum tipo de aviso prévio. Então o Meu Rio sugeriu uma ação que foi o Guardiões da Escola.
A gente instalou uma webcam na frente da escola para monitorar a escola 24 horas por dia. Em caso de movimentação suspeita ou de risco de demolição da escola, essas pessoas seriam alertadas por SMS e iriam proteger a escola contra a demolição.
Mas quantas vezes as pessoas desistiam? Porque a gente parecia maluco. Eram, sei lá, 10 pessoas lutando contra o Estado e o município.
Em 2013, o governo do Estado desistiu de demolir a escola Venerais. Entender um pouco como acontece esse jogo, né, por trás dos panos e que ele é escondido muitas vezes justamente para que a gente não saiba, é quase que um legado que o Meu Rio acaba deixando para as pessoas que se engajam com a gente.
Uma mãe, uma avó, ela pôde acessar a petição, assinar, compartilhar, ela pôde ligar para a Câmara dos Vereadores. Então, a gente aprendeu a utilizar essas ferramentas de uma maneira inteligente, para que as pessoas também participassem, elas se sentissem também atores desse processo.
So that was one of the first campaigns that we ran. That was not an immediate, but there was a victory there. A key part of it was the webcam tactic that we mentioned in the video, where we installed a webcam in front of the building to monitor it 24/7. And what was interesting about that, and that was one of the first insights that we had early on, was that we thought that the people who would sign the petition would be people from everywhere in the city. But the people who would actually sign up to become guardians, so watch the school through the webcam and then be alerted via SMS in case a bulldozer came over the summer vacation, we thought that would be primarily the school community. The actual way in which we developed the tactic was because the parents were suggesting a sit-in during the summer. They were really afraid that the school was going to be demolished when there was no one there, when the students were gone for the 3 months of summer vacation. So they were suggesting that we occupy the school. But because these were primary school students, very young students, that just didn't seem very practical to have hundreds of kids living in a school for a few months. So we thought that the webcam would sort of help us maintain a physical vigilance and then be present in case we were needed without having to actually live there for a few months. But we thought it was going to be primarily the school community itself that was going to sign up. But we ended up with about 1,200, 1,200 volunteers who signed up and received these SMSs. And in the 2 instances in which we actually called people to help, we had a few hundred people physically there every time. So this went far beyond the immediate school community. And that was one of the first insights that we had then, that then guided a lot of the work that we did after that. And it was around this idea of solidarity and how you can't really go further in democracy without sort of fostering solidarity ties amongst people. We often think of democracies, or in the way they should work, or power works in democratic settings, as sort of the power struggles between groups that represent themselves and that have their best interests at heart. And that's true for sure in many ways. But there is also a lot of solidarity going on that we don't see. So people may actually want to be active politically without necessarily putting their immediate needs first. For many reasons, because they recognize that at a certain point there is urgency around someone else's needs and they may want to stand in solidarity with them, or because they might see that their needs are already addressed and they want to be allies to someone else. So we did a lot of thinking back then on these concepts of allyship and solidarity, not knowing that very soon, the way that the political polarization has sort of played out in Brazil, these concepts would be at the center of so many political debates. And there will be this broader conversation in social movements about identity and solidarity and allyship and what that meant in practical terms. For us, the way we sort of thought about it and then empirically experimented with it, we had 2 main components. We had this idea of people doing real things that require real effort on behalf of others in the city because they recognize the importance of that cause or that group and that community. But it also had a component of leaving protagonism and sort of representation to the people who were directly affected. So even though we had a large community of people that were monitoring that school and then coming physically to protect it, and there was the threat of physical violence then because the state came with bulldozers and the police, and so there was a real request being made of people then, which obviously we couldn't make of the kids because they were not the ones who were going to stand up to physical violence. On the other hand, when we went to the public hearings, I saw a little there was a part of the video that was the father, one of the kids, speaking at a public hearing. Every time we went to a public hearing or went to the House of Representatives, we brought the kids and we brought the parents, and they were the ones to speak. So that was sort of the way that we navigated it then, not knowing that then these things would become so loaded with political meaning very soon. And we realized that ensuring adequate representation and ensuring that people can speak for themselves is hard. It's very hard because you sort of face very structural ways of keeping people out of the political process, even in little things like logistical details, right? The public hearings that were scheduled to decide on the future of that entire area, including the school, were always on Wednesdays afternoon. So they were on Wednesdays at 4, and that meant that it was really hard to be there if you were a working parent or someone who just couldn't show up somewhere at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. The way we sort of tried to work around that was by running a crowdfunding campaign where people shipped in, and we rented these big safe buses that would bus the kids from the school to the public hearings every Wednesday, and they went with the teachers. But the school that wasn't allowed to sort of have that expense. So we paid for that through the community that chipped in. So it was about 1,000 people chipping in with some money. And then we had these buses on standby for a few weeks as the public hearings were unfolding. And there are many other details like that that sort of show you how we started thinking about solidarity back then. And that stood with us, right? That idea that really this is what the work is about. And this is how we sort of build and reinforce democratic values in society, not just expect democratic governance, but actually think about what it means to be a society that wants to be a democracy and that sees each other as a community that it's worth being a part of. So that was one of the early insights. And then on top of that, we developed other projects that also have solidarity at their core. And one of my favorite ones, which is still very much unfolding, is Mapa do Acolhimento, which is a platform that connects survivors of sexual and gender-based violence with therapists and lawyers that provide them with free services. MAPA is now present all over Brazil, providing services to thousands of women. So I'm just going to show you this quick video to give you a little sense of how it works.
O Mapa do Acolhimento é um projeto que visa ajudar mulheres em situação de violência, em situação de risco, que sofreram algum tipo de violência de gênero durante a vida delas, ou agora, recentemente, com o apoio de voluntárias advogadas, voluntárias psicólogas, que podem prover o serviço gratuitamente e acolher essas mulheres num momento tão difícil da vida delas.
Já encaminhamos 4.800 pedidos de ajuda para 2.500 voluntárias. Estamos em mais de 900 cidades, nos 27 estados do país. E aí uma potência muito grande aqui dentro é esse olhar regionalizado. Então, é um projeto nacional, mas ao mesmo tempo muito regional, muito específico para cada região. Porque cada mulher recebe um acolhimento de uma profissional que está no seu território, que compreende esse lugar e que compreende a potência de pensar estratégias para essa mulher conseguir sair.
A gente trabalha junto com a rede de serviços públicos. É um trabalho super bem feito no sentido de que existem profissionais muito boas dentro da rede de serviços públicos, mas a rede está sendo completamente sucateada. A gente percebe cada vez mais que iniciativas como o MAPA acabam sendo fundamentais.
Hoje, muito mais, é urgente a gente falar sobre violência de gênero e a gente trabalhar com prevenção e acolhimento.
Porque as mulheres não precisam só ir à delegacia e fazer uma denúncia, elas precisam de muito mais do que isso, né? Elas precisam de pessoas que estejam ali por trás dos bastidores, né? Apoiando, aconselhando, acolhendo, na verdade.
A gente vê um aumento do número de denúncias, mas a gente não tem um serviço suficiente que possam acolher essas mulheres.
E as pessoas que não têm acesso? O que elas fazem? E essa mulher que sofre violência? A quem procurar? Foi quando eu escolhi o MAPA e sou muito feliz com isso. Então, quando veio o MAPA, eu me senti acolhida no meu pensamento de servir, colocar minha profissão a serviço das mulheres e da defesa dos direitos das mulheres.
Tem um retorno real de que o nosso trabalho está fazendo efeito. É um projeto que recebe o retorno de que a gente está mudando a vida das mulheres. E é por isso que é tão poderoso.
Eu agradeço de coração poder estar trabalhando com essa equipe interdisciplinar e que realmente faz um trabalho muito bonito no MAPA para poder atender a mulher que sofre violência. E eu, como mulher, me sinto muito orgulhosa disso.
Que esse projeto traz uma esperança, traz uma quebra de paradigma, traz um motivo para a gente seguir adiante.
So for MAPA, as you can see, we chose, when we talk about MAPA, we choose not to look for survivors. So we have survivors in our network that ask for help. We don't usually interview them because we don't want to we don't really use their information for anything other than matching them with the right professionals. But MAPA is now, which is why we talk to the volunteers and the team as a way of sort of bringing their voices into these kind of conversations. But MAPA is now in 843 municipalities in Brazil, which means we have physical volunteers physically present in 843 cities in all states in the country. So virtually anywhere in Brazil, you can get access to someone either in your city or in a neighboring town that can help you. And these processes take a long time. Therapy, the average number of consultations that the survivors go to is 27. We really closely monitor the first 10 consultations to make sure that they go through that first stretch, because that's when we have a lot of dropout. And then for lawyers, it varies a lot. But when there is an actual process that has to be gone through, most of the cases that we take on are custody cases, and these tend to take a while as well. So these lawyers do mostly custody cases. And now what we're seeing, and I think that's an interesting piece of this, is MAPA volunteers starting to organize in their states to advocate for better public policies for women in this situation, because they're meeting each other, right? They're providing this work, but we also do, in the case of the psychologists, we do supervision per state. So they have a supervisor in the capital. Not every one of them can participate in the supervision process, unfortunately. It's something that we're working on. But in the capitals, we have groups that undergo supervision with a more experienced therapist. And that means that they're meeting each other and building trust amongst each other as volunteers. And we're talking about a few thousand volunteers. Right now, it's about 3,000 volunteers who are active in the network all across the country, right? And some of them come from smaller towns to the capitals for the supervision meetings, which happen monthly. So they're meeting each other and identifying that they have common causes and that they see this problem that they're trying to tackle through very similar lenses, even though they oftentimes are not on the same side of the political spectrum. So one thing that we noticed that was really interesting to us was how they could very quickly organize and make decisions as groups to advocate for certain policies. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In spite of the country being really fractured right now, it's really hard to get consensus from any given group on any type of political action in Brazil right now. If you randomly select a group and they're not all in the very same sort of partisan line, it's going to be very hard to get consensus, typically. Because the discussions are so heated. What happened with MAPA that we noticed was that because the volunteers knew that they were dedicating hours, actual energy, actual time to stand in solidarity with other women, there was this idea of them all being on the same side when it came to that agenda. And that really helped them then not doubt each other's motives in a conversation. And we started noticing this in a campaign that they actually asked us to run in São Paulo. Let me just find this because I think it's a good example. Yeah, so this is the governor of São Paulo. It's a man called João Doria. And João was, before he was mayor of São Paulo and then governor of São Paulo, he was a sort of celebrity/businessman who used to host The Apprentice in Brazil. Don't know if that rings any bells. But yeah, so he became mayor of São Paulo after The Apprentice. And then he became governor. And he's currently the governor of São Paulo and may run for president, who knows. So this guy, right after he was elected governor, he vetoed a project coming from the São Paulo legislative, which would create 24-hour police stations for women all across the state of São Paulo. And this is a demand from the women's rights movement that has been sort of going on for a while, that there be specialized police stations that are staffed by women so that women with any case of violence can come in and know that they're going to be welcomed by a team that understands what they're going through and that will not push them away. And when he was campaigning for governor, he had promised to open these police stations, but then went back on that promise shortly after the election and actually vetoed the project. And we had Mapa do Acolhimento, I thought I had a WhatsApp group, sorry. We had Mapa do Acolhimento, of course, very active in São Paulo at the time. I thought I had the screenshots from the WhatsApp conversations, but it's fine. It will be very small anyways. But what was interesting is that the group of volunteers that works in São Paulo, they have a WhatsApp group. where they talk to each other all the time. And we have a team member in each WhatsApp group for each state with all of the volunteers sort of monitoring that conversation to see what surfaces. And at that time, when João Doria said he was going to veto the project, the volunteers started talking to each other on the group. And quickly, they decided that they wanted to pressure João Doria. And they actually asked Nossas being the organization that created MAPA, to help because they know that we also have a strong sort of history of public pressure. And here's what I thought it became really interesting. It was very clear from the conversations that they were having that a good number of them had voted for João Doria. And João Doria is on the sort of political spectrum. He's definitely more to the right. And we had a good number of them who had voted for him. So they didn't want to have a campaign that was instrumentalized to hurt him. They wanted to pressure him. They wanted to tell him that they didn't agree with that decision, but they didn't want that pressure to then be used by the opposition to sort of hurt him more broadly. So their fear was, what if through my activism, instead of actually advocating for the women that I care about, I'm being used by a broader party force to essentially play a game that isn't my game? Does that make sense? So that came across in the group, and very quickly, all the other women in the group were like, no, this is not what we're doing. We don't want to hurt him. Like, we don't care whether or not, like, that's not it. We just want to advocate for the women. And because they had that strong identity already formed around the project, no one doubted that. There wasn't any fear of a hidden agenda, if you know what I mean. So when we launched the campaign, you can see that the campaign, even visually, even if you don't understand Portuguese, he has his face, like it's definitely pressuring him, but it's not a campaign that shines a bad light on him. So it wasn't, the name was, there's no time for violence. So, because the whole thing is, police stations for women have to be open 24 hours. And on weekends, that's actually Sundays in the afternoon is when we have a spike in gender, domestic violence in particular in Brazil. I don't know how it is in other countries, but it's definitely like that there. So that's when we needed the police stations to be open. And we said, Doria promised us 10 police stations for women in São Paulo until the end of March. And he only implemented one and then vetoed the other one. So let's pressure him so that he can follow through on his promise. And he did. So after this campaign, he went back on the veto. He let the project be approved. And then he started, of course, capitalizing politically on these police stations because he realized there was real political demand for this. So he went to all of the openings and made all these pictures and like posted profusely on Facebook about this. And we loved it. We're like, oh, this is great, because now not only he's following through on his promise and we got what we wanted, but he made it something that he cares about, at least publicly he does, which means that he won't dismantle it, right? Like there will be a real political will to keep this up. You can only really do this if you give the politician in question a noble way of being pressured, because no one wants to lose, right, in the sort of the political game, especially when you are in a polarized political environment. So when they say yes to a popular demand, they want to do that in a way that is a victory to the people, but is also not a defeat for them. And there is a very fine line there. And we also realized that solidarity was key, because we had a solidarity network first. And that network was strong and thriving in São Paulo. Through those ties, which had already been established, it was a lot easier for us to get to a place where we could collectively pressure a decision maker without allowing political disagreements, which will always exist, get in our way. Now, this would be a lot harder to do if you weren't Doria, if it was Bolsonaro speaking. And I think that's where there is a limit to how this works. When you see an elected official or politician that is taking stances that are more clearly anti-democracy, then I think we have a limit. And that's something that we can discuss, which I think is a fascinating discussion. But that's something that we're now starting to learn to deal with. Because at the same time that there is a limit, there's also, in our minds, because we work with people, a very clear recognition that there is legitimacy in that power. And we took a little poll of our members. We're now at about 1.5 million members across Brazil in different cities. And about 30% of our members voted for Bolsonaro. Our members, right? So of course we have a bias in the 4% of the population voted for him. So we have underrepresentation of Bolsonaro voters in our membership, which is somewhat expected. given the type of campaigns that we run. We're very vocal on women's rights issues, LGBTQ rights issues that are divisive for this electorate. But in spite of that, we have 30%. We thought it was high, actually. We're like, oh, this is why? How did this happen? We were happy about it because it means that we have an open channel of conversation with these voters, but we wanted to figure out what was going on. So we did a little qualitative analysis just with a few of these voters and in-depth interviews with them, trying to understand how they sort of conciliated these things. And we realized that, as we all know, it's fractured, right? People can make a voting decision based on a few priorities. And in this case, the thing that came across the most was corruption and perceiving him as the person who wouldn't be corrupt and wouldn't allow others to be corrupt. And that perception may be wrong or right, but that was the perception that was driving that vote. And that was a priority for the vote, which doesn't mean that they agreed with everything that Bolsonaro did or said. And even that they weren't willing to position themselves against him on issues. But again, like the same concern would surface again. If I position myself against him on an issue, I don't want that to weaken him as a president, which is a weird stance somehow, but it's what came across. And people are weird, so we sort of have to deal with that, right? Like we're dealing with people who have to deal with their quirks and the way they think about politics, and it's not rational, but it is emotional. And the way that you build emotional tie to someone else is by recognizing him or her as an equal, as someone that you respect, and more than that, someone that you were willing to stand up for. And we really think that solidarity has a strong role to play in that. So that's sort of how we've been working with it. I'm going to show you a last case and then shut up and talk to you about other things and take your questions and the discussion. But there's another project that we ran, also based on this idea, which is now becoming public policy in Rio. And it's called Discussant. It's a WhatsApp-based system for collaborative reporting of police brutality, where we take people's videos of police brutality over WhatsApp, keep it anonymous, and then we open official representation on behalf of victims and the people who send us the evidence without them having to represent themselves. And we rely on a network of volunteer lawyers to do that, but all of the cases are actually under our name, or were. So I am currently suing quite a lot of policemen in Rio. But it was an act of solidarity, institutional solidarity in that case. We realized that the reason why a lot of people didn't want to report on police brutality was because they were afraid of retaliation. But you don't need the victim to be the person who represents in these cases, because the public prosecutor has a right to take on some of these cases, and it can also represent privately through an existing civil society organization. So it put our credibility and our institution on the line, so we could protect them. And now actually Discussant is becoming the official channel for collaborative reporting of police violence for the Human Rights Commission in the State Assembly. So it'll be the State Assembly actually putting these cases forward. Just want to show you how it works really quickly, and then I will happily take all of your questions. Let me make sure that I have the... Yes. Okay. There you go.
A existência da favela já é uma forma de resistência.
Esse sentimento de estar o tempo inteiro alerta é uma característica do morador e da moradora de favela.
A violência de Estado ela não acontece na cidade inteira da mesma maneira em todos os bairros, nem contra todas as pessoas da mesma forma.
Quando a gente está dentro do território e a gente se depara com algum tipo de violação, a gente precisa entender, buscar formas ali rápidas de como ajudar aquela situação a ser resolvida. E muitas das vezes a gente não encontra esses caminhos de fato, né?
O Estado ele vê a favela como uma reivindicação menor. A reivindicação de um favelado contra um abuso policial não é tão grande coisa assim, não é algo tão sério assim.
Eu trabalhei na Comissão de Direitos Humanos da LERJ, fazendo atendimento ao público. A gente recebia muitos casos de violação, de violência de Estado. E aí você tinha que fazer um grande esforço de pesquisa, de vídeos, de fotos. E depois você tinha que gastar muito tempo na burocracia. Então, quando a gente desenvolve o Discussant, ele surge como uma ferramenta para facilitar, simplificar tudo isso e aumentar a segurança do cidadão que decide denunciar a violência de Estado. Basicamente, o Defesap é um número de WhatsApp em que o cidadão pode enviar sua denúncia e os vídeos e as provas que possui sobre aquilo. Ele vai ser atendido pela nossa equipe, que vai fazer uma análise desse material e vai fazer essas provas chegarem onde elas precisam chegar para que tenha um tratamento a essa violação. Esse tratamento pode ser desde a investigação sobre os responsáveis, passando pela questão das indenizações e também a parte de prevenção. A partir dessas informações, a identificação de padrões, a gente faz cruzamento de dados nos casos para que a gente possa fazer diagnósticos de violações sistemáticas e cobre das autoridades públicas medidas preventivas para que essas violações não voltem a se repetir.
Todas as informações que o Defesap discute ali, ele devolve para mim. Então eu sei para onde vai ser encaminhado o meu vídeo. E eu posso não concordar com aquilo e falar para eles, olha, isso aí pode me prejudicar. E ali o cálculo ele é refeito. E outro caminho ele é pensado.
Então essa questão de trabalhar, entender essa segurança, essa fórmula, né, de como isso acontece para manter a segurança do usuário, eu acho que faz total diferença.
O que a gente está vivendo hoje no Brasil, especificamente no Rio de Janeiro, não é à toa. A polícia ela aperta o gatilho, mas por trás dela existe todo um aparato estatal que garante que isso vai se repetir.
O morador comum, né, como a gente acaba dizendo, ele tem um celular na mão e se ele vê uma violação, ele pode filmar, ele está fazendo uso consciente dessa tecnologia, podendo auxiliar numa nova perspectiva de território.
This was the early 2016. It's grown a lot since then. Voila. So that's the Defesap. And yeah, I think we can discuss, take questions.
Then, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Alessandra, first for this interesting and so important presentation. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting today. It is a real pleasure to be here, to meet Alessandra personally for the first time, to have the opportunity to say thank you for these winds of hope you bring to us today in these so dark times we are living in. I will make some very short comments only to start the discussion and open up the debate with all of you. I think that this kind of discussion is exactly with what the Brazil Lab is aiming to provoke, to think about issues that go far beyond Brazil, such as the new ways of doing politics in this contemporary world in which two main characteristics are mixed: the predominance of conservative and reactionary populism in the strict sense of the term, that they react against social advances achieved or consensually observed as positive until not long ago, and the increasing presence of digital media in the ways of doing politics, thinking and acting, collective articulations, demands and rights. The discussion demands an extra effort because, as many of you know very well, the contemporary Brazilian conjuncture tends to impose itself with an unusual intensity every day, renewing threats, absorbing energies, and challenging us in our objective to see longer and beyond Brazil precisely. Then, with this spirit, I would like to make two comments with some questions to hear you more about two issues. The first is related to the place of these forms of participation and activism that you are involved in these initiatives, the place of this in the very rich history of Brazilian civil society activism. The second has to do with the more concrete political field in which these initiatives are situated today. In the last part of your talk, you were talking in a way about these allies, adversaries, and the way of dealing with this so polarized world. Then first, very quickly, as we know, there is a long history of civil society activism in Brazil, an amazing and impressive history which go back to the resistance to the military dictatorship regime, the creation of a huge and very diversified field of NGOs, and not only NGOs, many things, going back to the 60s, to the beginning of the 90s, etc. I would like to point out two characteristics of this rich and important field of civil society activism in Brazilian democratic fightings, I would say. First, the strong international connections linked in a good measure to the history of the Brazilian exile. The case of Betinho, for example, is a good case. Many of you certainly know him. The second characteristic is the strong relationship with the Catholic Church, and mainly with the comunidades eclesiais de base and the pastorais sociais, the basic ecclesial communities and the social pastoral care, linked to the idea of solidarity, of course. I will be back to the religious point in the second comment, but what interests me here is to hear you about how you, this new generation of militants and organizations, post-2013, I would say, incorporate or position yourself in relation to the history of previous social struggles of Brazilian civil society. It is clear that between the expansion of the field of NGOs and associations in Brazil since the 60s and the present moment, there was a striking experience, that is the arrival of the Labour Party to the government, to the power, and the absorption of a good part of the militancy in the federal government and in several state governments as well. A classic paradox of the relation between civil society and the left governments that, as we know, has the tragic effect of weakening civil society instead of strengthening it. But the fact is that there have been great and important experiences arising from the relationships such as the experience of the participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, the Orçamento Participativo in the early 2000s. And so I would like to hear you about that history and how you see yourself in relation to it. Of course, I am not just referring to the question of digital militancy, which is obviously a form that did not exist before. I am referring to how history is incorporated or not precisely by this new militancy, and how it reverberates among the people with whom you are working, creating, perhaps even rejection, yes. Militancy and memory, let's say, is in a strong sense. The second comment, very quickly, is more linked to the field of action at the base. We could say, to the landscapes of solidarity and activism in Brazilian marginalized communities, especially in the big urban centers where you have concentrated at least a significant part of your actions, no? As you told us. As we know, there the presence of the old generation of civil society organizations has almost disappeared, along with the enormous weakening of the Catholic organizations. I am not going to talk here about the network of illegal markets or the militias, which, as we know, are increasingly occupying spaces, supplying services, justice, assistance, and also care. No? I would like to point out another equally well-known phenomenon, the massive occupation of these associative spaces by the evangelical churches and associations, especially the Neo-Pentecostals, and the most recent confluence of the evangelical activism with digital activism. No? How experiences like yours are situated in that field? who are your allies and enemies in that field of community activism and solidarity, which, as you have said, is now so polarized. On the one hand, neo-Pentecostal groups, on the other hand, victims of violence associations like others, for example, the Mais de Mayo, the Mothers of May in São Paulo, etc., who are identifying themselves as victims of the violence, urban violence. No? The Brazilian urban popular world has changed a lot in the last decades. The presence of militias and evangelical networks, the growth of individualizing aspirations also, as some researches on these issues show, linked to the theology of prosperity, of emprendedorismo, entrepreneurship, that have grown in parallel with the precarization of employment, the growth of indebtedness, of individuals and families. All of this seems to undermine solidarity. Then to end, how do you situate yourself in this complex contemporary political universe, which can surely be hostile to and indifferent maybe to the associative activism that you are practicing and proposing? I think your last words about the links between emotions and politics is of course a key venue to think about this. So thank you, and let's go to the discussion. Okay, thank you.
So thank you for your questions. So the first one on how we situate ourselves historically in the sort of rich history of organizing and civil society, in the civil society sector in Brazil at large. That's something that I ask myself about all the time, because of course we are in civil society in Brazil identified with this sort of post-2013 generation. For those of you who didn't follow, like 2013, we had big street protests all over Brazil that really changed profoundly the way that people engage with their representatives and with each other, and also of institutions at large, including big NGOs, more organized social movements. So I think in many ways 2013 was the start of this, or not necessarily a start. We had been working before then, and we saw others that were working before then, but there was something that shifted in the way that people relate to institutions and how much they trust them in that moment. So for us, I mean, it's been an interesting ride trying to situate ourselves in that history. Oftentimes when you hear a Brazilian describing how social change comes about in Brazil, they will tell you, or we will talk to each other about how we usually bring about change through consensus or through some sort of non-conflictual solution. So the end of the military dictatorship, in spite of all the movements that opposed it for many years, at the end of the day, it ended through a consensual solution. The military sort of conceded some and transitioned the country through a very long transition into democracy. And no one really got punished for the crimes committed under the dictatorship. No one really, the people who tortured other people, like, they're still standing. Some of them are alive. Some of them are president. Sorry, no, he didn't actually torture anyone. He just likes the ones who did. That's his words, not mine. So anyway, so we tend to find these solutions that are very that keep the peace, at least in the way that it appears historically, right? And that's the same. I mean, if you go back, we are a country whose independence was declared by the prince, the Portuguese prince, who wanted to just stay in Rio because it was awesome. So he was like, I'm not going back to Portugal. I'm just going to have an empire all for myself, and I therefore declare independence. I'm summing it up, and the historians in the room might want to kill me, but in a way, it is what happened, right? So that in many ways masks the fact that behind those peaceful solutions, there was a lot of struggle and real conflict and real blood being shed and real violence being directed towards people who were on the side of dissent. And oftentimes the peaceful, non-conflictual solution is found after that struggle has happened for some time. And when the powers that be sort of realize that they need to find a peaceful way forward. Otherwise, it will be taken from them, that power. So I think the role of civil society has always been critical in that way, but not often recognized, because when the solutions are found politically, the ones who are struggling and fighting are not necessarily always part of the actual new status quo. There are exceptions to that, but that has happened multiple times, right? We say that the abolition of slavery in Brazil, for instance, was like what we learn in middle school when we're kids. It's the Portuguese princess signed this law, and then all of a sudden all the slaves were free. And there's not a lot that is taught in Brazilian schools about the struggle and all that happened before, leading up to that, and then what happened after that, once you had formal abolition, but you had all these structures that were still in place. I think that's where civil society works and has worked, in that struggle that is often hidden and behind the scenes and not always recognized when the solution is reached, but is critical to moving the country forward and advocating for equality, for justice in a country that is so profoundly unjust even today. So I see NOSAS and the work that we do as being indebted to all of that rich history of fighting. But I also see that in many ways, the role that we play, the contribution that we make to that field that has such a history, such an interesting and rich history, is precisely in the way that we talk to a new audience and find new channels of communicating with that audience. And that's not something that the more recent civil society, so the one that flourished in the late 80s, early 90s, after the end of the dictatorship, has done that well. Because things change and institutions don't necessarily change at the same pace as the world is changing and audiences are changing. And I'm sure that in 30 years, we'll be sitting and looking at someone much younger and going, oh my God, we didn't even see that change. But oftentimes when we're talking to NGOs that have been around since the 80s, and their leadership and their members, that's what comes across. Like, oh, you have something here that we haven't been able to develop, and it could be useful to us. And that's one of the reasons why NOSAS is multi-cause, why we don't pick one thing. We're not a women's rights movement. We're not a police violence movement. We're not any of that. We're all of these things. Because really our value add in many ways is not on the actual subject matter, is on the way that we mobilize. And we want that value add to be available to a range of partners and organizations that might benefit from it. So every time that we launch something, we have a partner who is a real issue expert and really knows what's going on with that issue. So for the FESAP, so I showed the website, there is a technical committee that we put together with people, some of them who are EDs or of NGOs that have been working on the field of police brutality for 30, 40, 50 years since the dictatorship, right? And in the same thing with Mapa do Acolhimento, we have women who have been active in the women's rights movement and active in violence prevention and gender-based violence prevention for many years, who really know that. But of course, then there's tension, because when you are an issue expert, you might not necessarily want to distill the essence of your message in a way that is oftentimes needed in order to have that message then carry across, especially in an information environment that is so fragmented as the one that we have today. So the relationship is often amazing and really productive, and it's often not. And we sort of have to find who our allies are, and also know that we're, of course, we don't know all the answers. We know a few, and we try to implement those that we know, and we're continuously striving to learn and cultivating sort of new leadership from within the organization as well, so that we don't become frozen around this vision that Miguel, my co-founder, and I had back then. And so that's sort of on that regard. When it comes to the religious movements and the neo-Pentecostal movements and how that has shifted the country in many ways, I think that's a lot trickier. My co-founder is identified like very openly and publicly Catholic, which is not something that you see a lot in like younger generations. The Catholic Church has definitely lost their young following. But this history of the Catholic Church being so instrumental to so many social movements, in particular solidarity-based movements in Brazil, is definitely something that informed us. Because it was in his upbringing and the way what he brought to the table when we started. And so I think in a way that made us more open to this idea, the very basic idea, which not all progressives in Brazil would agree with, that religion and politics and political activism, they're not at odds all the time. Of course, we're very much for the separation of state and religion. We're not advocating for a non-like, how to say that in English? State, but we also don't demonize, to use a word in that semantic field. We don't demonize people who believe, who see religion as an important part of their civic life, and who see in the church and the churches, when it comes to the evangelical movements, places of solidarity, places of association and associativism. And that, I think, has made us more sympathetic to that audience as well that has grown so quickly, the evangelical, neo-Pentecostal audiences. But most of the time in our membership, the people who are working with us and are members of the organizations that we launched or active in the projects that we launched, who identify themselves as neo-Pentecostal, as evangelical, are second generation evangelical. So their parents might have converted to Igreja Universal do Reino de Deus or whatever, but they were already born in the church. And it's funny how that changes everything in a way that as Catholics, we could completely recognize, because it's very different, like when you are the one converting and when you're born Catholic and you sort of identify with that identity because you were baptized and maybe your mother goes to church every Sunday or a grandmother does, or like you have respect and appreciation for that community, but you're not dogmatic about it. Because your relationship to it is more from a place of tradition and affection and emotional connection. It's not necessarily from a place of, I need to follow everything that this institution says and need to agree with every position that they take. And the generation that we are most clearly connecting with is a second generation neo-Pentecostal, second or third in some cases. That's easier, I think, for us. It's also shown us that there's really no use in sort of lamenting the fact that Brazil has become more neo-Pentecostal. That's just demographics. We're like, that has happened and will continue to happen. We will have a majority of neo-Pentecostal, people of neo-Pentecostal faith and affiliation in Brazil in the next 20 years tops. We will. Like, that's just sort of, you follow the way the population and fertility rate and like all of that, like that will just happen. We can be very sad about that if we think of the interference that some of these churches are having in government, which is worrisome. But leadership and followers are very different things. So you can be very critical of some of the leadership in these churches and the way that they've been trying to influence policy through a religious lens, without much regard for, of course, freedom of expression and also just other ways of living life and other beliefs. That's different from the people that follow those leaders. And we tend, I think, all of us, and that's something that I see in my work as a practitioner very closely, very day, we tend to be much more forgiving of our leaders than someone else's. So it's very rare that I would meet an American, for instance, that would judge themselves by the positions that the American presidents have taken over time, this president or others, or the wars that have been fought. Like there is this distance. That's the leadership, and we can critique that leader. Like we have a relationship with that leadership that, of course, there's some responsibility there because it's a democratic country. They were voted in, but there's also a distance, right? When we also understand that choice happens within many other like there are many forces at play that condition that choice in many ways. When it's someone else's leadership, we tend to conflate these things a lot more. So if your leader is horrible and I hate them, then therefore I must hate you too. And that's just not how, sort of from a practitioner's perspective. I don't look at this from a theoretical framework, but seeing how people engage, that's just not how they live their activism or their political life or their civic engagement. They can trust a leader for some things and then be very critical of them for other things. They might not even necessarily rationalize it as criticism, but the fact of the matter is they take what they want, they leave what they don't want. So that's for the evangelical thing. And then, but then you're right. I think there's a broader movement, which is not just the theology of prosperity. It is that too, but there's a broader movement towards individualization and individual actualization. Everyone is a company. Everyone is, which means that everyone is sort of precarious. I had actually pulled up a picture. Let me just show this to you. Because I thought the conversation might go there. Let's see. This, I love this picture. It's very sad, but I love it for many reasons. So this picture was taken during the recent floods in Belo Horizonte. We had unprecedented rain in Minas Gerais this summer season, and there were some very real, very dangerous floods. And this is iFood, just like Seamless Web, is like a food delivery app service that works. I don't know if I think it's Brazilian. I don't know if it works. It's in English, but I think it's Brazilian. I don't know. So very popular in Brazil. That's how people order their pizza, right? And in the middle of the flood, there was this iFood delivery man who was stranded in the middle of the street and could have died very easily. And some newspapers then went and found him after, and he said that he had been unemployed for 2 years and was working 10-hour days for iFood as an independent entrepreneur, trying to make ends meet. And he took, even after this picture was taken, he then escaped this area, which was very heavily flooded, but then he took 3 more orders before going home on that day. And it's very telling, like the iFood will increase their delivery service fee if it rains. So they know it's raining, they know where it's raining, they know exactly what's going on, right? But they wouldn't shut down the service. I'm not even like going into the taking responsibility for him because he's clearly an employee. He's not an independent entrepreneur, like someone who's working 10-hour days for a company. Like some relationship needs to exist there. But they wouldn't even like say, in this area where there's literally a river down the street, we're just not gonna place any orders here. We're not gonna put our delivery people there. He was not there delivering. That's also something that in an interview, like the newspaper didn't really make much of that. But for me, was the most striking piece of information on that interview was that he was not there to deliver to the customer. He was there to pick up from the restaurant. So he just really had to go there because that's where the restaurant was. And no one was like, maybe we should just not accept any orders from this particular area for these 2 hours. That just wasn't, the reason why I'm giving you this example is because I think it's an extreme, very visual example of how in this society of atomization, individualization, everyone being responsible for their personal well-being and risk being most severely placed into the individual. So the company isn't taking any responsibility for the very real risk involved here. If he had an accident, he wouldn't be considered a workplace accident because that risk has been shifted to him. And the same thing with the state sort of shifting risk left and right and dismantling social security networks, etc. I think what that leads at the end is to this society where everyone has to fend for themselves. And that is fundamentally, I believe, at odds with the idea of a democratic, vibrant democratic society. Because if really you're just fending for yourself all the time, what's the use in living with others? I mean, the practical advantage of being in a community is also that you share risk, you share joy, but you also share some of life's hardships. And that's how you sort of figure out how to live without having to necessarily prepare for everything individually, which doesn't even make rational sense because one individual will not go through all the potential sources of hardship that you can have in life. But if you have to prepare for all of them alone, then you're just taking way too much, right? So anyway, so I think that's really a problem for the work that we do. And that's, I think, where we see the field, right? When we talk about our field, our partners, we're not talking about left and right. We're not talking about Bolsonaro or anti-Bolsonaro necessarily, although we have taken an institutional stance against him, but our members may not, and that's okay. We're not talking about whatever. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is, do you believe that living together and helping each other and being there for each other, being in a community is something valuable or do you not? And that's, I think, where the real dividing line is. And if you don't, then you're probably our enemy. You asked about enemies and allies. I won't name names, but that's sort of how we see it. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it makes a lot of sense and very powerful. So why don't we collect a set of questions? Let's try to strive towards condensation so we can get more people asking a question or a comment, and also people have to leave. If you have to leave, no problem, please do so. But hopefully some of you will stay. So can we collect a first round of questions? For Alessandra? Federico? Yes, Ernesto.
Thank you very much for your very enlightening presentation. I believe that the founding sort of idea basing your work is the idea of solidarity. And it just struck me the idea that for certain groups, people are more concerned about their own interests. And then you will see solidarity operating in a very strict form. So for instance, we talk nowadays about the problem of identity politics, more concretely. So people involved with gender issues are not necessarily sensitive to the discussion about race. And people discussing race are not necessarily sensitive to the LGBT rights. And how can you sort of, from this fragmentation that we see nowadays, try to put things together in a way that people from certain groups will be sensitized by the demands of the other groups and see this as part of the same problem in a way, you know, equality, rights, and community building. Because if you're fine in your own struggle, but you ignore what is happening just next to you, are you really talking about community here? Are we really talking about the defense of rights in a broader way? So I wonder, how can you, in your work, reconcile these different trends and this fragmentation that you're seeing happening?
Okay.
Yes, Marilia?
Yes, no, I thank you very much. It was so informative and beautiful campaigns and fantastic. I'm very glad to know about your organization. My question goes to the direction of indigenous groups and ecological issues. So do you have, or do you work, or do you know about groups that are kind of similar to the violence group in Rio? If you have any other kind of initiative that will help protect our environment.
Yes, okay.
Great. Then I have a question. How are you thinking about the electoral route?
Yes.
You know,
me personally?
You and not us, you know, like not necessarily at the federal level, but do you see another scale of intervention?
Yes.
Do you see the political game shifting on that front of democracy to towns, to states, you know? I'm curious to see how you're thinking about that dimension of the democratic process. And Kimberly?
And I think a bit related to that, I'm so inspired by your passion for democracy and solidarity. Right, and so, wondering how you see, is Nassau's representation of democracy working or not working? And does it mean, related to maybe Joanne's question about electoral politics, do we need different formal democratic structures or not, or how do we consider that?
Okay, meaty questions. I'll try to be quick so I can take all of them. So on identity and fragmentation, intersectionality, all of that. It's funny, I mean, even before, we had a session with our staff a few years ago, 2 years ago, where we discussed the concept of intersectionality. Not all of them were familiar with it because it was very big in some academic centers, not so much in others. And it's just, people have very different types of formal education in our staff. So some of them were hearing it for the first time, but they all understood exactly what it meant. And then someone, I think it was Lana, who you saw in the Discussant video, raised their hand and they said, well, we see that you don't need to teach us this, right? Because if you look at the way our members behave, because we're a multi-cause organization and we are digitally driven, we have a lot of data on how people engage. the people that have engaged with us. So we know, like, if someone started their life with us through an anti-corruption campaign, that they then went to an animal rights campaign, and then maybe a mobility campaign, and maybe, like, how did they shift and change in their engagement? And are there any patterns? Some people have very strong patterns. They only engage in gender issues. Most people don't. Most of them don't. But then we also know that there are some journeys that are easier to make than others. So from corruption to human rights is very hard. There's a very big gap in between, which is interesting. From animal rights and human rights, the gap is wider. It's harder to do that. And I say this, like, this is just this is just our membership. It may not be reflective of the general population, but for our 1.6 million members, we've sort of seen that repeatedly. But most people actually engage in very different things all the time. So they already have intersectional activism in the way that they operate in the world. Again, the leadership may not follow. And oftentimes people who are leading movements are people who are passionate about that one issue and have been just looking at that issue for years. So they are amazing specialists and have so much to contribute on that issue, but their view is a bit narrow when it comes to other issues, which is fine. The people who are following, who are not the leaders of the movement, but who are participating in many ways, are very rarely like that. And it's very rare that your experience, your lived experience, and that, I think that's fundamentally what identity is all about, but it's very rare that your lived experience, it only relates to one form of privilege or exclusion. So what we have observed is that people are already there. We're just sort of trying to create a theoretical frameworks to describe something that is already there from a practical point of view. For some people it isn't, and that's fine. But for most people it is. And I think as activists and people who are trying to lead some of these movements, our responsibility, our job is to recognize that that's already there, be open to it, and also sort of foster more compassion and more listening amongst ourselves. Like, leadership has to talk to each other and understand their bridges, because otherwise they're not serving their movements well. But you're right, it's not always done in the way that maybe it could be done. And I see that very clearly. Like, I'm a feminist. I'm sort of, even outside of NOSAS, I have like my own sort of like feminist activism personally. And I see that in the movement is very, very clearly and often. In particular, less with LGBTQ rights, a lot more with racial issues. So that's sort of in the definitely there. On Joan's question, the second one on electoral, the first one was, so there was electoral,
no, just
electoral.
She had the
yes.
environmental and indigenous.
Yes, I want to take
and
that
then
one.
the electoral, and then the institutions of
we
democracy.
We don't do any work in the forest, for instance. Like, our work is decidedly very urban, but we're obviously very worried about what's going on in Brazil, and particularly in the Amazon. We have friends there and people who are activists there that we exchange information with. And our strategy for this year is going to be working in Amazon cities, because we work in cities, so that's what we know how to do. That's the contribution that we can make. But also because 92% of voters in the 9 states where the Amazon is, in Brazil, it's very big, everywhere, 92% of voters are city dwellers. And civil society traditionally has focused more on sort of forest populations, right? Which makes sense, made a lot of sense. Now I think we need a strategy for the urban dwellers, because they are the ones who hold political power. And that sort of touches upon the national-local question a little bit. The federal government is not going to budge. I don't think they're going to be, like, tomorrow committed to protecting the Amazon. With sort of like what happened last year with the threats of boycott and economic sanctions and other heads of state speaking out very clearly. It's very rare that you would see the international community react to anything more forcefully than they did last year, and still nothing really changed. So I have zero hope that it will. I mean, if it does, then I'll be pleasantly surprised, which is always good, but I wouldn't count on it as an activist. However, local governments, I think, are easier to persuade, and some of them are already engaged. And I think in that potential impasse between federal government and local government, we need to strengthen this side of the equation. And the way to do that is not by sort of talking about it in Rio or Sao Paulo is by making sure that their voters, their constituents, the ones who actually vote for them and give them power, are worried about these issues and are voicing that concern and are informed and have ways of channeling that into a movement. So I think we need an urban-led climate movement in the Amazon. And that's what we are focusing on. But we know a lot of people who do amazing work through other lenses that if you're interested, we can definitely talk about that too. What should I do first?
Both of them.
Oh God. Okay. So electoral, as I said, I think that we are not only in Brazil, everywhere, we tend to be sort of hypnotized by national politics, and of course it matters very clearly. I think in the United States it matters more because the United States is such an international force, and the nation has this power to go to war and to do things that are very, very clearly important to the world, not just to the country. In Brazil, it matters too, but local governments are actually really powerful. And it's a lot harder to let polarization become such a leading force in the way that people make decisions around policy when it's the local level. Because it's closer to home, right? We were saying this yesterday. I was meeting with Kimberly, and we said, it's a lot easier to be for federal funding in public education than it is to be for the closure of your schools, your kids' school. When it hits close to home, I think some of these conversations become less about ideology. Are you in principle pro or against public education? In principle pro or against public health? And they become more about that service, that place, that particular community. It's easier to engage. It's easier to empathize. So it's easier to build ties with someone who may disagree with you because you see the sort of personal relation that they may have with that issue. So I really do believe that local government is a good place for us to deposit some of our activism. But even beyond that, as an organization, we're 501c3 equivalent in Brazil, so we can't really play electoral politics. But some level, some types of elections we can be involved in. And they are the hyperlocal elections or elections for elected posts that are not mediated by parties. So Brazil, for instance, has an elected figure called the Conselheiro Tutelar. And Conselheiro Tutelar is a sort of child services in the United States. So the child services representative for your district is voted on by the district. And that person has real power. They have a salary, a budget for a team, maybe 3 or 4 people, and real power to essentially recommend that a child be placed under institutional care because of a situation of abuse, for instance, in the family. So the evangelical Christian leadership has, for the past 2 election cycles for child services, for Conselheiro Tutelar, really focused on that, on electing Conselheiros Tutelares, because it is a bastion of sort of family protection, and family is important to them. So they want to make sure that families stay intact, and then you have Conselheiros Tutelares that are pro-family. Unfortunately, what that has meant oftentimes is that these Conselheiros Tutelares tend to neglect situations of domestic violence because they may break up the family if the woman decides to then do something about it. In that kind of election, nossas can get directly involved in. If we wanted to do a plate, let's elect thousands of Conselheiros Tutelares that are committed to democracy and inclusion and some of these issues, we could, and I think we should. The same with neighborhood associations, with school representatives, university representatives. All of those are powerful. They have real power, real incidence, and we're not necessarily paying attention to them because we're so obsessed with national politics. And also, I think in recent years there's been all this buzz around renewal, right? Political renewal. And renewal of Congress, new figures, new people, young blood, which is really important in many ways. But Brazil didn't really have a problem with renewal. We had about 50% turnover at every congressional election. So, it's not like people are there forever. But even if we did, and even if that's a really real thing to do, which I think it is for other reasons, but you're only going to get so far if your strategy is let's pick some brilliant kids and let's elect them to Congress. You're only going to get so far as to elect the outliers, right? People who are really, truly exceptional, truly charismatic, or they may not be, but they have sort of found an issue that sort of is in the zeitgeist, and somehow they sort of get get through the cracks. If you want a real renewal, like in the majority, if you want 50% plus one people in the Congress who are committed to a different set of values, who are not traditional politicians or the sons and daughters of traditional, then I think you need to start a lot earlier. You need to make sure that these people are getting elected to student council, to neighborhood associations, to conselhos tutelares, to local city council, to all of that. Because that's how you sort of build numbers, and then you have a real pool of people that can then go into. We like, and when I say we, in this case, I'm talking about like the more sort of progressive movement, right? We tend to like the shortcuts for that, and I don't think the shortcuts are going to get us very far right now. So that's sort of.
Well, we count on you for the long run, Alessandra, Orofino. Thank you so much, Federico and Alessandra, for this incredible conversation. And you guys can stick around, keep talking with Alessandra. She's a few more minutes around here. What a wonderful audience, wonderful questions, comments, and thank you all for Alessandra for your amazing work.